Welcome and thanks for coming. Feel a bit like David Frost with this kind of clipboard affair thing here. Just to kind of explain a wee bit about how David ended up going to Haiti. As you probably all know, newspapers haven't got very much money anymore, and the initial thought about Haiti was probably not to send. It's a long way away. It was going to be very difficult. We were getting a fair amount of agency material in, and then the video editor said to me, "Hey, why don't we send someone to Haiti?" And I said, "Well, it could be David, couldn't it? Because he can do video and stills." And that's how we ended up sending David. It was kind of a jointly sponsored trip by the video department and the picture desk. You know, which is kind of an interesting thing, but obviously it put a lot of extra burden on David's shoulders in a way to have to produce video and stills. And the other thing was it was quite difficult for the picture desk to stop phoning or to not keep phoning David and asking him for the latest still of the day, because, you know, he really was there to concentrate on video. Anyway, David, how was it for you then, really? So you got a call one morning that there was a plane waiting for you?
Yeah, pretty much. And then that evening I was en route to Haiti, and obviously heard about the earthquake and was very interested to see how the situation was developing in the first 24 hours. And I'd been to Haiti in 2008, so yeah, I was really kind of watching the images with...
That's why his name came up. You'd been there before.
Been there before, yeah.
I forgot that.
So yeah, I was really watching as as it was all unfolding with a keen interest, really. And I suggested, I think the earthquake struck on the Tuesday afternoon, if I remember rightly, and so on the Wednesday I kind of mentioned to a couple of people that I'd be interested to go if they did want to send anyone, and then it was Thursday morning that I got the phone call to say, we want you to go. So yeah, it was just a mad panic to get everything ready in about 6 hours and get to the airport. And the plan actually stopped as far as Dominican Republic, because no one really knew how anyone was getting in. It was obviously very early on, so we just booked our flights to Santo Domingo via New York, and then just had to sort of get there and see what happened, really. So I was lucky enough to get there quite quickly. Actually, the journey was quite easy. I teamed up with a group of German filmmakers and journalists, and they chartered a small plane from Dominican Republic directly into Port-au-Prince, and they had a spare seat, and so I slipped them a bit of cash, and then I found myself on a plane very quickly, which was amazing, because I'd heard lots of horror stories about other journalists trying to get there in the air and circling around Port-au-Prince for hours and hours and then being forced back. So it was really difficult to get in the first place. So getting there was surprisingly easy, but it was when I got there that things got really difficult, obviously, and I was actually stranded at the airport at Port-au-Prince for about 10 hours with communications were down. I couldn't get in touch with my journalist, and yeah, it was a good 24 hours, I'd say, after arriving in Port-au-Prince before I managed to start actually working. We had a journalist, Ed Pilkington, who's based in New York, who actually arrived there at roughly the same time as me, and I'd been in contact with him trying to make a plan, and he'd arranged to stay with a family that a friend had put him in touch with. So after spending the night with an ABC film crew, there are lots of film crews that helped me along the way, yeah, they took pity on me and put me up for the night in a hotel that they had, and it just by chance was just down the road from the family that my journalist was staying with. So following day, met with Ed, and that's when I started to work. But yeah, as Roger said, I was there, had to keep on reminding myself that I was there to do video primarily, and I was obviously getting whatever stills I could and was filing images back to the newspaper every day with, as the journalists were kind of returning to file their stories. But the thing I was really trying to focus on was the video, and it was almost like any pictures I could get were a bonus, really. So.
I mean, the whole kind of video stills thing is still a big learning curve for us, not just for the photographers who are kind of in the front line for it, but obviously for the picture desk and the video desk as well, because the video desk works in slightly kind of longer term way than the picture desk. The picture desk is used to getting someone there, getting pictures out virtually immediately and getting them in the paper. Whereas the video department are used to having to sort of bring film back because we're not a broadcast organisation. You know, normally video has to be kind of physically brought back into the building.
I think that's...
So those sort of lessons, there's lots of lessons that we've probably learnt and forgotten already as the way of these things. But we're kind of gradually getting our heads around it. And one of the big lessons here was that we just couldn't really rely on David to produce stills for the paper. And it was kind of unfair of us too, but because we had one of our best photographers there, you know, the temptation to call him as soon as we could was always hitting us, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was, I mean, I had internet connection there, so I was seeing roughly the images that were being printed every day, and the eyewitness is such a force in The Guardian, and I've always been very keen to get eyewitness photographs generally as much as possible. So being in Haiti, I think I saw 7 eyewitnesses maybe printed on consecutive days, all from Haiti, and that was incredibly frustrating for me, really, knowing that I wasn't kind of doing the stuff that I'm used to really doing in that sense. There was some just fantastic imagery coming out, and I felt that I wasn't getting it.
Just on a personal basis, do you think that it made you think about wanting to do video or not, or just sticking with stills? And for certain photographers I know have kind of made that decision already that video isn't really for them. And
no, I really enjoyed doing video, and I mean, at times it's very difficult resolving in your own mind that you're there to do video, or just trying not to get overwhelmed with doing video and stills. But I kind of like the challenge as well, I think, and as long as you have got a sense in your mind of which is taking precedence, then I think that's okay. I mean, I definitely really enjoy doing it. And now on jobs a lot, actually. I'm kind of, like just today I've been out with, on the election campaign, and there were quite a few moments where I was thinking this would make a great video, and it just comes into your mind more and more, actually. That
She's crossing over to the dark side, obviously, already. Just tell us about your tent, or not a lack of tent.
Yeah. Well, this was the whole thing about being stranded at the airport and not being able to get in contact with my journalists. It was just logistically very difficult. The whole trip, the whole job was really tough. And as a result, when I met up with Ed, who'd kind of teamed up with a couple of other journalists, and they were all moving around together, for a good 3 or 4 days, I was at their mercy, really, as to what they were planning to do each day. There was a lack of drivers, fuel, guides, so we all were kind of sharing the same driver and guide. So that I found the first few days incredibly frustrating from both a video and a stills point of view, that I wasn't really getting the freedom to do the kind of things that I really wanted to do. So yeah, I kind of said a lot when I got back, if only I'd have had a tent, then I could have broken free from them quite early on and just tried to team up with Oxfam or one of the aid agencies, and just, or there were lots of journalists in hotels or out on the lawn and stuff, and I felt very dependent on the journalists, overly dependent for the first few days. So I kind of felt when I got back that I'd learned a lot about responding to that sort of situation, and that if I went back, I'd make sure I had a tent really, so that I could have some sort of independence if I did find somewhere to stay. But as it happens, things did get easier as the job went, and actually I went to places with the journalists that I certainly wouldn't have gone to on my own. So it's a kind of give and take thing, really. You kind of have real frustrations and problems working with other people, but at the same time it kind of opens up all sorts of opportunities for you as well. So
we watch the video now, and then we can talk about what David saw.
Yeah, it was a 7-minute-ish piece that went up on the Guardian website just a few days after I got back.
We obviously had to pull David out quite quickly just to get the video up in time, which is another problem for a kind of a newspaper organisation rather than broadcast media.
comment ça, pendant mandat la caille là, pour y a moi entendre un bail qui coupe, li pété. L'elle pété me le bail cap tout la crier m'a pas là moi Jessie sauve-moi Jessie petite mon dehors. Pour y a deux petites là mené bon moi, yo mené yo tête yo cassé, et puis pied yo blessé. Som nan jou sanda, pas fond. Cabane moi tout en bas ça. Cabane moi en bas, dans fond. C'est dans déboué yo aller en pérade, nous joine 2-3 graines bagaille nous mettre mais pas souvent rien. Rien, nous laguer deux bois balancés, c'est souterrain. Nous sortis là, tout le monde. Là, nous tout petit. Ça mourir, après l'embouer, c'est timaré nous pas qu'à faire rien. Grand goût, nous sois blancs, nous pas rien manger, problème, toute qualité problème pour nous. Mon malheureux là qui malade là couché, c'est-il cassé, il va pas lever, il couché là après. Nous avons besoin d'aide. De nourriture, d'eau, de logement.
Once the food actually ran out, you know, the people still, their spirits didn't even really drop. I mean, it's pretty amazing to me. Some of these people, they're dealing with some very, very tough, trying situations.
What are you guys eating down there?
MREs. And whenever I heard about it, you know, I was kind of disappointed I had to leave my family, but on the other hand, I was kind of glad we weren't being deployed for a combat reason. I was glad we were being deployed to help.
Where were you before this?
Iraq in 2007.
You prefer Haiti?
Yes. No one's shooting at me here.
For us, I don't know if we're going to be passing out anything today. It's going to be more security for U.S. dignitaries.
En fait, on fait le chargement pour après emmener sur le lieu, mais je ne sais pas où encore. Nous, on a juste l'ordre de charger les camions, on nous dit quel camion charger.
Non, c'est tellement gay, mamie. C'est tellement gay. Je passe misère à faire. Et pour me boire, pour me tuer tellement avec. Oui, pour me tuer tellement, ma fille dans tout bagage parce qu'elle ne pas
Papa. You found the lady inside?
Yeah,
she's alive.
Yeah, she's alive. She's really in good condition. I know that's unbelievable, but she can communicate with us efficiently. And right now, we're just on the way of taking her out.
In this response, anything is possible, and we'll search as long as the government of Haiti says that search and rescue is still the mission.
Everybody's spoken with her almost 6 hours. And she's perfectly conditioned, and she has very logical sentences, and she can just able to move her feet and fingers.
Je suis pas content là, attention, là il y a une victime quand même.
Attention. Vers les sables, tout à fait.
Donc c'est les qui vont s'en occuper. C'est les Américains. C'est un miracle, non? N'est-ce pas?
Oui.
Oui.
Un miracle, monsieur.
je travaille dans l'école où je travaille à l'écrasé, je n'ai pas de moyens pour vivre, j'ai plusieurs petits monde, quand ils m'ont écrasé, pas un côté pour m'arrêter, maintenant je suis pour petit monde en province, pour même je suis à la protection. Ici, je n'ai rien pour y aller, je vais retourner.
That's what we produced from David's material. I think it's quite interesting that it's slightly different from a TV kind of production, that there isn't a television journalist kind of fronting it up, and I think that's the great thing about this stuff on the web. I mean, did you feel like you wanted to put some of your own words there, or was that?
No, I kind of like to avoid that as much as possible and let the characters lead the piece through. I mean, I was working with Ed, so there were a few times where I'd suddenly get him to do a piece to camera to kind of explain something that we were seeing, but it does change the whole dynamic of it completely when you start to work with a kind of anchor of some kind. And I mean, I've done quite a lot of films for the web now, and some where I'm just completely on my own, ultimately, like this one, or others where I am working with a journalist, and they're really, I much prefer. It takes more courage, I think, to kind of not use a journalist or an anchor, but they're usually results that please me more, really. Once you kind of get over that worry and fear, then it's just much easier to get right involved with what you're seeing.
I kind of think that's the future for photographers, turning to video in a way, to author their own stuff and not to become cameramen for journalists, really.
That's right.
That's the sort of ultimate for us, I think. What about the soundtrack? What sort of problem was that for you? Because sound is always a problem for us, really, isn't it?
Yeah, sound's one of the real challenges with working with video generally. It wasn't such a problem here. I mean, I think I probably kept a radio mic with me, for instance, but it's such a frantic thing that you're doing that you just sort of try, you kind of wear the headphones, get it approximately right, and let the editor kind of deal with all the messiness when you get back. I was quite lucky to have the actual music, which really helped to lead the piece in and out from the church service that I saw there. Otherwise, we might have tried to look for other bits of music to put in there, which always helps. But no, sound in this case wasn't too much of it. It wasn't something I was thinking about too much.
Just get away from the practicalities of things. I mean, how much of a shock was it when you saw what was going on there for someone who kind of spends most of your time doing portraits for us? Yeah,
it was the first time I'd done anything like that. I've never been to any war situations. I've done quite a lot of difficult stuff in places around Africa and Asia, lots of stories with health and various aid agencies and charities. So although I'd never really come that close to death, essentially, I was quite used to working in difficult situations. So it wasn't too much of a shock. And I think actually when I got there, it was sort of 3 days after the earthquake when I arrived, and you kind of hear stories about bodies in the streets, lots of pictures coming out of death and destruction, and you are kind of taken with this slightly horrible sensation that you need to get there as quick as possible to see and photograph this horrible stuff that you're hearing about. So I think the whole time, really, having so much to think about professionally, both with video and stills, that gives you a way to take a step back from it, or hide from what you're seeing, or be so involved in the job that you're doing that you don't really stop and think too much about the horrors that you're seeing. And I think it's about trying to strike a balance between being, well, I guess, cold and dispassionate in a way, through the not getting too involved, and also not getting too emotional. So you're kind of trying to tread this fine line, really, so that you're being involved enough so that you're telling a story, but not being too overcome with the horrors of it.
Okay. And how did you feel when you came back? You know, going back to sort of civilian life over here, if you like, and did you feel like you were pulled out too early because of kind of practical reasons, or?
No, I definitely wanted to stay longer. I was desperate to see more. I think the whole time I was there, I was overwhelmed with the sensation of not seeing enough. The situation was so huge, so vast, and you really feel like you're just seeing. It was kind of scratching the surface the whole time. And there were always things that I was driving past and not having time to go and see. So I'm desperate to stay, actually, when I was there.
Because I've never been there, but it turns out it's a much bigger place than one would expect. Port-au-Prince.
Yeah, it's huge.
Is it the size of Birmingham or something, you thought?
I don't know what.
Someone said that to me.
Yeah, that would seem about right, and it's very hilly as well. I mean, lots of the places where you were seeing images coming out, the kind of downtown area is very flat, and the destruction was immense there. But there's lots of the kind of city that stretches around to the hills around the edges, and that was one of the things that kept on getting. In fact, I'll show you. Shall I just go to these stills? I can reference them. One of the first things that I saw, the first times that I got a sense of the destruction, levels of destruction, were driving down the hill from where we were staying up in Pétionville. Look. So this was a place called Canapé Vert, and it's really just kind of links Pétionville and the kind of suburbs up in the hills down to the downtown area. So every day we were driving past this hillside, and actually slightly off. Slightly off the picture, up into the sort of top left. There were all these settlements up in the hills, and I just couldn't get away from this this desire, really, to go up and find out what was going on. You could tell that there was just landslides of buildings up there, and you were kind of down in either downtown areas or the foothills and seeing that there was just nothing really happening in terms of a clear up. People, if they wanted to kind of find their belongings or their loved ones, were just having to do it themselves, and I just couldn't get away from this. It was just kind of haunting me, what was going on up in the hills and how long it would take any sort of rescue effort to get up there, and that was yeah, it was really quite distressing.
And you were saying that the looting that was playing on TV over here was overplayed.
Yeah, from what we were seeing, but that kind of it's difficult to be definitive about anything really. As I say, you just feel like you're only scratching the surface, so you can only take in what you're seeing. But we weren't seeing any loot. It was right at the end of my trip that I started to get to experience some of what people were calling looting downtown. And it was quite chaotic down there, but it was a very localized thing in a very small area with a small group of people. So yeah, the kind of, as the journalists particularly were getting a real sense that it was being over-reported, and there was quite a lot of pressure being put on some of them to kind of report on this looting that we weren't seeing, and that it was a real struggle for them to persuade their editors back home that they weren't prepared to report something that they weren't seeing ultimately, and we were quite the opposite, seeing a lot of calm, a lot of people just being very calm and trying their best to get on with things. So.
Do you want to just talk through some of the pictures?
Yeah. This was the kind of first day that I started working, and just this Italian journalist picked me up and said, "Come on, let's go. I've got to go to this children's hospital where there are Italian forces helping out." So this was what I was saying about the first 3 days, just kind of being led around really according to what the journalists were doing. But it was really important, I think, to go to this hospital at the beginning, and saw a lot of. It was a children's hospital that had been opened up to adults as well, but they were predominantly children being treated there. This was a bit further on in the trip, actually, and this was sort of day 4, I think, and it was the first time that I managed to get out on my own. I managed to steal the car for a few hours in the morning, and it was incredibly liberating, actually. It was the first time that I felt like I could really spend some time. Like, I was driving through these areas like this downtown for the first 3 days, but we never stopped. It felt like I was only getting images from the back of a moving truck, and it it was horrible. So this day was really good for me. I got to spend a lot of time downtown and around and about to get some material, both for stills and video. This was a cemetery again on the first day. What I was saying before about not going to places, I wouldn't have gone to certain places if it wasn't for the journalists, and the cemetery was certainly one of these places. And we didn't spend too long there, but it's not really the kind of place that you'd want to spend too long. It was really horrific, and they were bringing coffins in every few minutes actually, and there were lots of bodies just being dumped at the cemetery. I think people would find dead people in the rubble and not really know who they were, and I think people were just bringing them to the cemetery, not really knowing what else to do with them. There were quite a lot of bodies on the streets, but obviously people wanted to clear those because of hygiene and smells and everything. Yeah, this scene kind of says it all really, and there were lots of other things like that up and down the alleyway of that cemetery there.
The Guardian published that picture on the front page in an incredibly naff way. Just positioned it with a cruise ship moored off the other end of Haiti.
Yeah, it was.
I couldn't believe it the next day.
Neither could I. I was told it was going to go on the front page, this picture, and I was really very happy about that. And yeah, I was thoroughly disappointed when I saw online how they put it.
Not one of our finest hours.
No. This was also quite early on in the trip, and there were conflicting reports about this guy at the front here who had been burned. Some people said he was a looter that had been apprehended by the police and then turned over to an angry mob who killed him, because there were really violent reactions going on against looters. Then we heard other stories about police killing people quite a lot. Never really got to the bottom of it. And yeah, I think Ed, we sort of chose not to report on it when we were there because it was unclear, and again, because we didn't want to overplay this looting thing. This was also Canopy Bell, this kind of hilly area where I'd spent a lot of time in my previous trip to Haiti, and it was yeah, it was a beautiful area. So we kept on passing through there and seeing all this destruction was nasty. This is outside of a morgue. A family had arrived. I think they were just on their way to a funeral to bury a family member. This was inside that morgue. Again, it was a story that I picked up with the Italian journalist that I was with, and the story here was that this body had been found and brought to this morgue, and then the family of the man found out that he was there, and they came to take him away. There were quite relaxed laws about burying family members, so I think they were planning to even bury him in their home or in their local church, but the morgue said, we're not going to give you the body unless you pay us $1,200 US. What I understood is that the morgue had carried out their duties or their services and didn't want to release the body unless they were going to be paid for having stored the body for a few days. In the end, they accepted $600. This was the family who managed to kind of scrape together money from friends and other family members, and ended up having $600 that they presented to the morgue, and they accepted that and said, just give us the rest when you can afford it.
Just going back to that picture of the family in the back of the truck. Mm-hmm. So what actually happened when you jumped into there and said, can I take your picture? I mean, what? Just talk us through that
Yeah, I mean,
moment.
I don't speak French, just a tiny bit. So there were lots of language barriers, and this, yeah, I didn't, I think I asked the Italian journalist that I was with spoke a bit of French, so he was able to ask them what they were doing there. And I was actually taking lots of stills, and this was a time, this is a good example of when you have a conflict between being a video maker and a stills photographer, because I was there in the back of a truck, and I was round at the opening at the rear taking lots of stills as the smell was awful. So somebody had brought a load of tissues, and one by one, there were quite a lot of girls just behind him, and they were one by one taking their tissues and holding them up to their mouth to kind of combat the smell. And I was taking lots of stills of that, and it was just at the end that I kind of thought that would just been a perfect piece of video, actually. And what I should have done is shot that as a video sequence of everybody kind of taking their tissues. And
I'm just quite interested about their reaction, though. When were they completely unsurprised to see you there? Were there so many photographers that they just kind of resigned to being photographed?
I don't think, no, there certainly weren't a lot of photographers in this at this particular moment. There were a lot of journalists and photographers flying around generally, so I think people were, even at this early stage, quite used to seeing foreigners running around with cameras, as opposed to the last time I was in Haiti, actually, when I found it much more difficult to work. It felt like a lot more attention was being drawn to you, but yeah, I mean, the other thing is that everybody had so much going on, their own personal tragedies.
Do you think they were completely shell-shocked and they were just sort of
I think so, yeah.
easy prey, if you like? Or do you think they wanted their stories told? Do you think they'd even thought that far?
No, I don't. I think they were just, really deep in their own tragedy, really, to almost not notice that I was there, and you'd exchange a few words here and there and try and pick up on a bit of story. But, I mean, you did find, it wasn't so much people desperate to tell their story, but they'd kind of really be desperate to find out if you were going to help them, actually. So a lot of times when you're speaking to people working on video or stills,
and as the week went on, they got more. You know, there's more desperation.
Yeah.
Where was the food?
Yeah.
You know, they'd heard the food was there, but it wasn't getting to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people would kind of talk to you for a while and tell you their story, and then at the end they'd be really expectant of something. What are you going to do to help us? And you'd have to, again and again, kind of tell them that you're there to do your job as a journalist and to try and bring the story to the outside world and try and hopefully generate help and assistance that way. So, yeah, it was a very difficult thing to deal with as a news gatherer or journalist, that you're.
What if it was a human being?
Yeah, yeah. There's not much you can do personally. Flick back through these. There's just some still. That piece in the video of the rescue was almost exactly a week after the earthquake. So we got there at 4 o'clock when that first shot of the guy saying, "Yeah, we found this woman, she's alive." So, and he actually said to us, "We're going to have her out within 15 minutes." And we'd only just sort of seen this going on at the side of the road. It was the first time I'd managed to stop and do a rescue, and so we thought we were really quite lucky that we'd stopped, and within 15 minutes we were going to see someone pulled out. But then it was about 8 hours later, we were still up on this roof, and it was amazing. It was one of the only very positive things that I saw there, actually, for the week. But there were a lot of problems between the, I think there were 3 different rescue teams there, the French, Turkish, the Americans turned up, there were the Haitians, and at one point it was a complete nightmare up on this. I think Rory, the journalist who I was with, at one point counted 90 rescue personnel of like up on this. It was just crazy.
Few people left.
Yeah, but by the time she was actually pulled out, things had settled down quite a lot. And I think that was something that was also reported quite a lot about this oversaturation of rescue teams and people almost fighting with each other to kind of do their job. And we definitely saw a little bit of that. She was singing as she was coming down. It was so amazing, and I was kind of in this typical frenzy of not knowing whether to shoot a still or do video. And my tape actually finished just at this point, and I was working on this ridiculous camera. This won't mention which make it is, but to change the tape, you have to pull the mic out. And I changed the tape just before she came down, and I forgot to put the mic back in. I was filming it thinking, this is amazing. I'm getting her kind of singing as she's... And then I watched through the tape when I got back, and there was no sound on it. It was horrible. This was when I kind of got to do some of the looting, scavenging stuff towards the end of the trip. It was really quite, I felt very dangerous down there actually. There were gunshots from police to kind of disperse people. It was the closest I've ever come to gunfire actually. But actually the people themselves weren't interested in us at all. It took quite a long time before I got out of the car, because it felt a very unsafe place to be, and the guide and the driver were very, very nervous about us being there, and it was a real frenzy, people running around all over the place. But then I saw a couple of photographers working, and that kind of gave me enough confidence to come out and sort of see what was going on, and they just didn't pay any attention to us at all. They were completely involved in their it was almost like a party atmosphere in a way. They were just kind of ripping things out of buildings and having a great old time. Never found out what happened to him. Somebody said that he'd just been pulled out of a building and burnt there, but I suspect not. I just think because of his posture, he looks a little bit, I don't know, there were, as I said before, reports about police killing people. So.
You also heard, didn't you hear that some bodies were burnt rather than burying them for health reasons? Or?
Yeah, I mean, all over the place there were bodies being burnt, and I think that was a lack of authorities clearing the streets. They were kind of everywhere at one point, and people would rather just burn them for hygienic reasons rather than just have them there decomposing on the side of the street. So yeah, I saw that a lot. This was a lawyer's, the offices of a law firm, and the lawyer had employed a couple of guys like this to try and get stuff out of the building. So we shot a whole load of stuff actually, and it was a little piece that Rory did, and kind of the guy was kind of sat on the road with all the things that these guys had managed to pull out of the building, and the pile was kind of growing, and they had certificates and things. And this was on the last day at Del Mar bus station. Government were laying on buses to get people out of the city to other cities, Gonaive and Cap Haitian. So lots of people were going out into the countryside, and that family, again in the film that we spoke to, it was they were going to Gonaive, which I think is up in the north, to stay with their parents, which during the hurricanes in 2008 had been completely flooded and destroyed almost, and it was, they had put up their family at that time in 2008, and now they were obviously lost everything, so they were going off to stay with their family up there.
So, do we need to contact Inigo now, or is that the thing to do?
Yeah, just before we call Inigo, we're just going to show a 5-minute selection of his footage from Channel 4. Just by way of explanation, he followed a baby over a course of 5 days, and this piece of footage recaps his journey.
France. The child has been in agony because of her skull injury. She was being treated for burns to her head at a hospital when the earthquake struck. Pulled from the rubble after 2 days, her mangled right arm had to be amputated. The Red Cross has been unable to trace her mother, who is presumed dead, or any other family members. British surgeon David Knott, a volunteer in Haiti, has been treating Landina for the past few weeks.
It's actually getting a little bit worse, so that's the reason why we need to have the baby transferred to a specialist unit.
Landina is just one of thousands of children who have suffered terrible injuries in the earthquake. Volunteer medics who have flooded into the country have often been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of those in need of specialist medical treatment. For Mr. Knott, saving Landina became a personal mission. He realized she needed an urgent operation which was unavailable in Haiti, and he contacted specialists in Britain who were prepared to help. But there have been many obstacles in the way. Because Landina has no known family and no paperwork, getting the documentation to allow her to leave Haiti proved to be a huge challenge. Transporting children, even for medical treatment, has become a sensitive issue in Haiti, following the arrest of 10 American missionaries accused of child trafficking. For 4 days, we struggled to wade through Haiti's shattered bureaucracy. Mr. Knott visited various government ministries to get the necessary paperwork for Landina, constantly aware that the medical clock was ticking. The final critical paperwork only came through yesterday afternoon at the last minute, as a helicopter was preparing to take her on the first leg of her journey.
Landina's passport. We've been very lucky so far, and even at the last second now, we've only got probably 10 minutes to take off. We've just made it, so good for her.
With everything finally in order, it was time for Landina to leave Haiti. As the helicopter climbed, the 3-month-old baby was lifted away from the wreckage of Port-au-Prince and the destruction she is too young to even be aware of. Beneath, countless thousands are left struggling to survive. Accompanying David and Landina is a French pediatrician, Francois. We arrive in the Dominican Republic. Landina's papers are used for the first time. Health officials make some inquiries. Another official says she has a child the same age. 5 hours after leaving Port-au-Prince, David and Francois check in for the flight to London.
Every human being deserves the very, very best in life. And if this baby was born in London, Paris, Washington, New York, it would have got the very best treatment.
It's the final leg of the journey, a 9-hour flight to London. If her surgery goes well, Landina will have to make this journey again, perhaps 6 months from now. Under the terms of her release, she must be repatriated to Haiti after her treatment. At Great Ormond Street, she's being assessed by specialists who hope to operate next week on her damaged skull.
I would hope that we can look after this little girl, remove the damaged tissue, reconstruct her scalp, get the wounds to heal, and we'll offer her the best. And of course part of that is trying to trace her own family back in Haiti.
Some might question all this effort and publicity for one baby among so many hundreds of thousands. But it's hard to see Landina and not to feel that all this is worth it and the right thing to do.
Did you take a sat phone? Shall I just keep chatting on?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we probably wouldn't want to call them a sat phone because we've known to our cost how much the calls are on those things. And any comments so far on or questions for David or I?
No, I used a video camera. I have got these stills cameras that I use, the 5D Mark IIs or whatever. They do shoot video, and I have done some video pieces on them. But in this sort of situation, and whenever I'm doing something where I know I'm going to be dealing a lot with people, I think the sound is a real issue still. Plus, with the stills cameras, you need to focus manually, and there's all sorts of problems with responding to kind of fast situations. I think for me they're better for more creative, considered pieces. But if I'm somewhere, if I'm under that kind of high pressure situation, then
a Haiti calling.
Yeah, so it's
Hi there.
Inigo?
Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi Inigo, it's Roger Tooth from The Guardian. You're kind of speaking,
How you doing?
You're speaking live to Paddington, I think. So how are things out there now?
Not too bad. It feels a bit like sort of some Charlie's Angels thing beaming in, you know,
weird.
with the voice.
So
I just had a few connection problems. The internet cut just moments before. I guess you were trying to reach me,
yeah.
but
you're coming through loud and clear now. So what's it like there now? What's changed in the
that's
past
good.
few months? Hello.
Well, in many ways, not much has changed. Still rubble as far as the eye can see. There's probably about 900. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes. So there's probably still about 900 tent cities spread across Port-au-Prince. I would say they estimated about 700,000 people living in those tent cities. And when I say tent cities, they're not really tents at all. In many cases, just scraps of material being held up on sticks, sometimes the odd plastic tarpaulin. There are a scattering of proper tents, but most people are really living in the most makeshift, conditions, and obviously struggling considerably now that the rains have started. Obviously these camps are now deluged at night time or late afternoon, and people are having to trawl through the mud to try and get some water or just something to eat every day. The food distributions have largely stopped, except in certain camps and some of the most vulnerable people. And there's a general sort of feeling, I would say, of frustration. I feel that I sense that that's building up more and more, and with some possibly worrying consequences. And overall, people asking, well, what is the future prospects? Are they going to be living in this kind of limbo state for months and years to come, or will this place finally be rebuilt? A lot of questions, of course, and not many clear answers at the moment.
Okay, so what are you intending to do at the moment? We just watched your initial film about the little girl. And what are your plans now? Why are you there again now?
Well, twofold really. One is to obviously further explore that story, and I've been trying to pin down details about the baby's family and to see what happened to the mother and so on, and any other family. And that's obviously been a difficult process, as many of these things are. Locating people here and pinning down those kind of details can be very difficult. And obviously looking at that issue and trying to explore that in the wider context of what's happening here, with both trying to locate families, trying to bring families back together, the issue of caring for the injured, of caring for children who've been orphaned, and so on and so forth. And obviously there's a pretty mixed picture. There are places here that do look after orphans. There are a number of orphanages some of which are quite adequate, where the buildings are still standing, but of course there are many others living in temporary conditions. Yeah. And I believe UNICEF had a report recently, and they estimated 1 million children may have lost one or both parents, or been separated from their parents. So this is a huge problem. Yeah. And I think in many ways, Landina's story exemplifies that, underlines just the scale of what Haiti is facing, both in terms of trying to look after these young children and give them some kind of future and give the country a future.
Do you feel that focusing on kind of single families or single people is the best way to try and explain this kind of huge, vast problem that needs a miracle to cure it, really? I mean, is that what you're going to continue to do you think, as a journalist?
Well, I think, I mean, in a way, it's not necessarily maybe a case of is that the best way. I mean that is just it. You know, this is on a huge scale. I mean, it jumps out at you wherever you go. I mean, literally around a few blocks from where I'm staying at the moment, I found an orphanage just about a week ago, and the original orphanage had collapsed, and there's about 65 children living in the front yard of a house, and they're having to cater for these children through whatever donations they can get, clothe them, feed them, you know, and look after them. You know, people volunteering to teach the children. One of the children I met there, her mother has been battling with HIV/AIDS for about 10 years. She leaves her at the orphanage because she can't cope. She lost her husband in the earthquake. And now there's an American couple who are exploring the possibility of adopting her, this young child. But that's a very fraught issue now in Haiti after what happened with the missionaries and the whole missionary story. And in many ways, the government has frozen the adoption process in this country in the wake of that. And so, you know, that's another whole issue in itself. What is going to happen with these children? You know, many people, you know, and I'm one of them, of course, support the idea that, you know, if it's possible to give these children a good future in this country and to build up the orphanages and allow them to have a proper, safe, secure life, that is the ideal way forward. But at the same time, and you know, people are really struggling, and it's not the only orphanage that I found where children are sleeping rough. I mean, there's a place I found down by the airport where children, about 60, 70 children are living in tents. Their orphanage was also destroyed. And there's a lot of concerns about how vulnerable these children are, given what's been happening in Haiti, given that there are concerns about violence, about also now rape in some of the camps and so on. So it's a huge and very vexing problem, and it's not clear yet how things will unfold on this front.
Yeah. How many journalists are kind of there now to tell the story? I know Michelle Obama breezed in this week and kind of presumably rolled up with the Washington Press Corps, and they all rolled out again, but how many people like you are left there?
Very few. I'm looking across this room at the moment. There's a couple of I can see. I mean, you know, yeah, it's the bare minimum. I think CNN have a couple of staff here. I've met people from, you know, a couple of British journalists, a couple of American journalists, but it's very thin on the ground. People are coming in either for a specific story for a few days and then leaving again. There's not much of a sustained presence. And I think that's one of the issues. And I think what we're seeing now is, in many ways, what happens to a country when the media leaves, when the interest starts to wane. And I think that is a real problem, because I think when there was this intense kind of interest and focus on Haiti post the earthquake, I think a lot was being done, because I think people were fired up, they were geared up, the cameras were on them, and so on. And now that seems to have slipped a bit. You're hearing a lot of problems with the hospitals. Some hospitals have closed. You know, some of the conditions in the hospitals have deteriorated. You know, the distribution of aid, there's a lot of issues around that. Are the aid agencies really pulling their weight? Where is all the money gone that people donated? Is it being spent properly and wisely? Is aid really getting out to the people? And without the media here, and without a kind of spotlight on that and holding people accountable, I think, unfortunately, there has been a lot of slippage in terms of how the aid effort is being conducted. And, you know, I think a lot of people have this idea that somehow Haiti's sort of all right in terms of, you know, being provided with on a general level. But when you look here on the ground, it's not playing out that way.
Yeah. Is the US Army still on the ground there?
They are. You don't see them around so much. I mean, when I was here last time, I spent about 5 weeks after the earthquake, and they were on the ground in a much larger presence, and they were involved in distributing aid. And I've only seen them a couple of distributions since I got back here, and that was mostly of sort of blankets and so on. I mean, they are still around, but they're planning to scale back very soon. I believe some of those troops will be sent off to Afghanistan.
Right.
And that is a concern to people. You talk to some of the people trying to run the camps, and the American presence, certainly like in Gulf Camp, where Sean Penn has his operations, has been an important security presence for them there, and they're concerned. They are concerned what will happen once they leave.
Okay, we've got a big audience here, so I think perhaps someone might want to ask a question of Inigo. Anybody want to ask anything? What's going on?
I'm holding my breath.
So what's your plan now? So what are you working on? You're working on another film for Channel 4, are you?
Yeah, I'm sort of a couple of things which they're interested in exploring about aid and so on, and I'm also following up Landina's story.
Right.
And
is she back there yet, or is she still in this country?
She's still in the UK. Yeah, she's in a recuperation period. She's had 2 operations. They removed the dead bone from the skull, and that was very successful. That was at Great Ormond Street, and then there was a further operation at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital for the burns in her body. So the doctors have been delighted with her progress, and she's done really, really well. So that's great news. Of course, then there's the issue now of her and her future, because under the conditions of her release, she's supposed to return to Haiti, and obviously that's a consideration in terms of trying to find out what's happened to the family.
Okay. David,
and then, yeah, I mean, just on a bigger level, I'm looking at the whole, what's happened, what has happened to the aid effort, and, where is this all going to go? What's the future really for this country?
Okay. I've got my colleague David Levene, who is over there. Have you got anything?
Well, yeah, just exactly on that. Really, you kind of mentioned the vastness of the problem out there, and that's really something that I couldn't escape from when I was there. How immense it was, and just incomprehensible, really, how any kind of aid effort can kick into action on that scale. And you say that's still the kind of feeling you're getting, really.
Yeah.
And do you see any way out of that, really, or is that?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about sort of 10, 11 billion was pledged at this recent conference. But the government here, with the international community, there's been no decision yet on how that money will be spent and distributed. They don't even have a proper mechanism to do that. And, you have, as I say, about 900 camps. They've just started moving people from Gulf Camp. It's the first voluntary move that's been done from one camp to another. But the new camp that they were moved to was on this kind of rather bleak, sun-baked plain on the other side of Port-au-Prince. And, it's certainly not ideal, but people are saying, well, what else can we do? If they stay in the Gulf Camp, they're going to get deluged with mud and the floods, and we have to move them somewhere. And, every time you try and solve an issue here, it seems that another problem arises. It's just so vast. It's a huge tapestry. And, I think people will be living in these camps for a hell of a long time. I can't see the reconstruction effort kick into gear for a while properly. Sort of makeshift schools are being built and so on, but not proper structures. And people are terrified of just staying indoors, inside. Even if a house is standing after the earthquake, people will not go and sleep inside it because they're so terrified still. We're still getting tremors quite regularly here. And so, it needs a concerted effort. The government here needs a lot of help. There's been a lot of concerns about if that money does pour in here, where it will end up, and whether it will be spent wisely and properly. And so that's obviously an issue in itself. And in the meantime, people are pretty pessimistic. They're expecting to be in these tents and these camps for a long time. But, of course, they're now expected, though, to provide for their own food. There are these cash for work programs, but they're pretty sparse, and they're only paying $4 or $5 a day to people. So you know, in the meantime, I think people's frustrations are building up, and that is a big worry. No one's sure what that's going to lead to.
And is that cash for work helping the clear up? I mean, you say that people will probably be living in...
Yes, some of it's helping clear up. It's clearing sort of general debris. Sometimes it's clearing rubble. And you see teams out in sort of matching T-shirts and so on. And this is part of the government's thing. You know, President Preval said we want to move from aid to reconstruction. I mean, that's all well and good, but some people are not even getting any basics, and people in many cases cannot afford to buy food because there is no work around. So, you know, it's a noble intention, the cash for work, but $4 or $5 doesn't go very far even here.
What about your personal safety, Inigo? Are you
I feel all right. I mean, I know there's been a lot of issues around this and kidnappings and so on. I do feel quite strongly that whole issue was hyped very much during the first period after the earthquake. And I think that was very damaging for the aid effort. And I think there was some quite irresponsible reporting, I think especially by some of the networks around that. You know, anyone watching from outside would think that Port-au-Prince had been taken over by machete-wielding gangs. But when you actually went downtown and saw the scavenging or looting or whatever you want to term it, I think it was fairly contained. And what surprised me after the earthquake was not the violence, really, but the lack of violence, considering the scales of the problems and just how devastated this place was.
Exactly what David was saying, wasn't it?
And I think that's continued. I mean, I think there are concerns at the same time, though, about what might happen with the issue of kidnappings and possible maybe political violence rising up again, given that people are increasingly frustrated and they don't put much hope in the government to sort these issues on a vast scale.
Okay. We've got a question from the audience for you, Inigo.
It sounds like from what you're saying that there are plenty of stories that you could tell, but I'm interested to know what the appetite is like of editors back here in the UK. Are you finding that there isn't really much interest for what the stories are because of the election?
I think the election is obviously playing a big part, as well as sort of Icelandic volcanic ash and whatever else. I think, you know, we can't compete. We can't compete with Nick Clegg at the moment. That's definitely an issue. I guess that would probably happen at any time of a British election coming up. But I think also it's a classic sort of syndrome that happens with the media, that you have a massive disaster and then, you know, the interest is, you know, sort of burning on for a few weeks afterwards and then starts to peter out. And, you know, I covered the tsunami in Indonesia, and I stayed on actually and went in, and sometimes a bit later than some of the other journalists. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle. I kind of paid my way to go out to Indonesia, and eventually did find an important story which I pursued and got some play with that. But I think it is a problem. I think there is a sense that, oh, we've heard it for now. We'll come back to this later. But again, as I said a bit earlier, I think it is really important that the media does keep up its interest and keep pursuing this story, at the very least to keep the aid agencies and governments and international community accountable for trying to help the people here and accountable for the money that's been donated for this aid effort.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the election has obviously steamrolled everything as far as we're concerned. Do you find you're closer to this story than you were the tsunami, Indonesia, or? I mean,
I think so.
Some journalists get kind of, you know, identified with stories and almost get hooked on them. Do you feel this is the one that's really kind of taking you over?
I think personally it did with me. I think there was something about the place, and I think you know, on a level not just a journalist but just sort of personally, that it was a sort of place that was fighting against the odds anyway.
Yeah.
And you sort of couldn't help but not only empathize with the people, but feel that you want to sort of somehow do your own bit to help out if you can. And I think that's one reason I became very involved with Landina's story, because I could see a way that perhaps if we focused strongly on this and pursued the avenues that were available, for instance, sort of, knocking down the door of the health minister, and so on, that we might get somewhere. And, I think, that raises questions. Some people say, well, should journalists get that involved in such stories? But I think in such a situation, you can't but help get involved if you've got, a degree of compassion and care about the places that you're in. And I think this place particularly is a place that latches onto you, and the people, the place, and the story. It is almost overwhelming at times what's happened here. And, I think it is an opportunity where journalists can make an impact and their stories can make an impact. And I think people do want to know. I really do think the general public wants to know. Unfortunately, perhaps we're not getting commissioned on the we should be, but I do think it's important to keep pursuing the story.
Okay. Any other question?
Yeah. I was out there. I work for an aid agency. I should declare that interest. I was out there the day after the earthquake and was there myself for about a month. And although I work for an aid agency, I work in the media team, so I'm used to kind of working with journalists and thinking about their concerns. And I'm glad that you mentioned that security was overblown, because I found that incredibly frustrating. I was answering all these interview requests about, rioting in the streets, and I, saw none of that, although clearly there were some incidents. But
yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to kind of, you mentioned the fact that it's important to hold the aid agencies to account, and we would certainly, we would love some reporting of what we're doing now, because it's basically, the trouble is people saying we're not getting any relief is sort of a story. People getting handed bags of food and getting cash distributions and getting back on their feet, not so much. It's not really that interesting as a story. I know, because it's my job to try and make these into stories. But how do you square that circle? Because you are saying that it's important to show what the aid effort is like, but in terms of news desks here, the aid effort is just not really that interesting. How do you deal with that?
No, that's right. I think obviously perhaps, media-wise, it's more sexy if someone's saying we're not getting anything than perhaps, as you say, maybe focusing on the things that are working. I mean, I suppose that's the same with, it could be the same with any kind of disaster zone or war zone in a way. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because I was talking to someone in this makeshift camp yesterday, and they'd had a tiny bit of help initially. They'd had a couple of latrines built, I think, but they'd had nothing since. No food, no water, no tents. And one of the aid agencies had been there and asked them to register, and then they never came back again. But this same aid agency, is running sort of 24 operations, and some of those operations are definitely successful and are reaching people. But then at the same time, there are examples where people have fallen through the cracks, and you kind of just can't help but wonder why that is. With such huge operations that have been unfolded and such huge amounts of money involved, how can it be that 2,000 people who they know are there and they know need help are not getting help, but other camps are? And so I think that is one of the issues that need to be addressed. I think the media, does highlight cases where there are successes. Of course, it's more news. It's more news if something is not well or people are not getting help. But I think we do highlight, cases there are, and that's what I'm planning to do in the next few days. But also highlight where this NGO has not met its pledges. And I guess it's a case of balancing that off, to give a fair and accurate picture. And sometimes, to be honest, it's much more complex on the ground than people realize. The reasons why people aren't getting aid in certain places are often quite complex.
Can I just add one more thing on the whole issue of getting aid getting through? And the thing in Haiti is that it has a lot of structural problems anyway before the earthquake that people are maybe vaguely aware of, but not particularly aware of. I mean, I think 10% of the population was on permanent food aid before the earthquake. I mean, it's a country with multiple infrastructure problems. And while billions of dollars sounds like a lot of money, it's not going to solve all the country's multiple problems. And I think that's the other thing, that people have this perception, all this money, why isn't everything sorted? But the problems are much deeper than that.
Oh, absolutely. I think the place needs to be overhauled in many ways. And, almost in many ways, they're going to have to start from scratch in Port-au-Prince, which may not be a bad thing if things are done properly and rebuilt properly. And that is the really important question. How's this funding going to be distributed? Which companies are going to get the building contracts? Are the buildings going to be built properly? Are they going to be earthquake-proof? Are there going to be proper spaces for people, and so on and so forth? And this is the kind of thing that, again, we really need to be monitoring and watching as this unfolds. And there's a lot of concerns about that. And yeah, I totally agree. I mean, as you say, they were starting from such a low base, and this devastation, I mean, a lot of places that were devastated were already kind of devastated, as it were. So this is a huge, huge effort that's needed. And I just hope that somehow they can get this one right, because I think this is a challenge, not just for Haiti and what we do in Haiti, but also an example to the world that the international community can respond to such a disaster and do the right thing.
Another question? There's a question down the front.
Yes, I was curious about the situation at the airport. At the beginning we heard that there were plane loads of supplies there, and the stuff wasn't getting out of the airport. I'm wondering now if that stuff has been distributed, or is it still piled up, and are new supplies coming in on anything resembling a regular basis?
I didn't catch all of that. I heard something about the sort of bottlenecks at the airport initially. Is that what you were asking about?
We heard that initially, but I'm wondering now if those supplies have been distributed, and if new supplies are coming in. Are things still piled up at the airport? What's the situation there?
Well, it's funny because I just met someone a few days ago, and she was a photographer who then ended up becoming a sort of aid worker almost. And she sort of went to WFP because she saw this stuff piled up in warehouses, and went to the American Army, who also had stuff piled up, and said, look, I'll get some trucks and go and distribute it to people if you support this process. And that's what she did. And so she kind of initiative herself, and that's now stopped. I mean, you don't really see any distributions, as I said. By and large, the food distributions have stopped in the camps. And they're quite keen to move people on from certain camps to other locations, and that's part of the reason. You don't really see stuff piled up at the airport anymore. The feeling is that that immediate emergency situation is over, and that they're moving on, as the President says, from sort of aid to reconstruction. But of course, there are these huge needs. So, I think the aid as it exists is getting out to people. There are still some food, or at least sort of some provision distribution that I've seen, but I would say it's quite limited. And people are being encouraged to sort of, to find work, and like these camp for work programs, and to stand on their own feet. But of course, that's easier said than done.
So are there new plane loads of supplies then coming in, or is that pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, supplies still come in, and there are warehouses which are stocked up. But it's not clear to me, because something I've been trying to pin down exactly who now qualifies to receive the aid that is still distributed. I mean, in some places, if you're not fully registered as a camp, like this one I went to yesterday, which had about over 2,000 people, then you get nothing. You're stuffed. You're not on the register, and that is one of the problems. I was in another camp a couple of days ago, and women with young babies were getting some provision, some oil and salt and cooking oil and salt and so on. But that was about it. And it's not clear to me exactly how they distribute to those camps and how they decide on all these things. And you try and get answers to this, you don't always get very clear answers.
Thank you.
So that's why my answer is not clear.
I wanted to ask a question, kind of following on from aid getting through and the challenges posed by the infrastructure. It seems like all the stories we're hearing are actually from Port-au-Prince. I wondered to what extent you're able to get out of the city to areas like Léogâne, Darbonne, and Jacmel. All those areas were affected.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, Léogâne is still very bad, and I've been out there before. And that sort of takes a couple of hours to get out there. The roads are damaged but passable. Again, there is obviously an aid effort going on with varying degrees of success. I think people are no sort of better or worse off than Port-au-Prince. I know that certain parts of Léogâne that I saw were very devastated, but I think that perhaps in some ways things might be easier there because you don't have the congestion and the overcrowding that you have in Port-au-Prince. And from what I've heard from people, generally people are in many cases are trying to sort of get on with their lives and things have picked up a bit. At the same time, I've heard that there have been pockets where, again, people are not getting aid at all. And I heard someone telling me a few days ago that there was concerns about medical help in Léogâne, in parts of Léogâne. I know that Reuters TV went up to do a story in a remoter area near Léogâne just recently where several hundred people have been completely cut off and not received any kind of aid at all. So you're hearing these kind of stories. And again, I would just say, I think it's part of the bigger picture that there are huge needs still, and I don't think there is clear and effective plan still in place on how to deal with this. It's all well and good to say we want to move towards reconstruction, but people still need food, they still need water, and they still need medical help, especially now with the rains coming. They are getting some of that to a certain degree, but you're hearing about it being very sporadic in parts. You're hearing about it being, for whatever reason, some people getting a larger amount of help than others. And again, I think part of it is perhaps communication problems. Part of it is a lack of coordination. And perhaps, again, as I mentioned earlier, part of it, I think, is a lack of the sense of urgency that existed in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake.
Can bring in more questions, Inigo? No? Okay, I think we'll let you go, Inigo. Thanks very much indeed. Oh, hang on.
I'm sitting here sweating, so...
Yeah, you look really hot. Is it really hot out there?
Yeah, it's very hot. It's the humidity as well. I mean, it's much hotter than it was just after the earthquake, and it's going to get a hell of a lot hotter.
Right.
So if anyone's coming in June and July, then stock up on the sunblock.
Okay, hang on a second. We've just got one more question for you.
I just wanted to ask, is there any form of government, proper government there now?
Is there a form of government? I mean, in the aftermath of the earthquake, the government was meeting, strangely enough, down by the police station at the airport where the missionaries were being held, and the kind of Prime Minister's temporary office was down there. And, you know, they've started to locate buildings where ministries are now being housed because obviously many of the ministries were destroyed. But again, it's sort of, this is a real issue. I mean, no one can often point out how to find these ministries, where to find ministers, how to get answers, you know, from the government over a whole range of issues. And that is a fundamental problem in itself. Because, you know, how can you coordinate a government response if you can't even locate where the government are? I saw a few cabinet ministers at another hotel near the airport the other day. I think they had meetings in different places where their structures are still sound. But again, yeah, I think that is a real problem from both a ministerial level, but also just on a local level. What kind of government or institutional presence is there? You see people in the camps who've been appointed by the government, people who are now involved in relocating camps. You see some police on the streets. But at the same time, you know, it's often very thin on the ground. It's very hard to get answers in terms of which government minister to approach, how to find out about government policies. And I think it's going to take a long time to get that kind of level of coordination and response up and running again.
Okay, Inigo, thanks very much indeed, and look after yourself, and we'll see your film soon, and we'll see you back here, hopefully if the sky's clear.
Can't hear anything.
Okay, cheers. Okay, any more questions or kind of discussion points you want to raise? I guess we should clear some pages in The Guardian now. for Haiti, but we seem to be doing. Someone said the other day, all the other papers seem to have got their brakes on with the election, but our brakes seem to have failed. But so we're kind of it's interesting coming here tonight because I mean it doesn't seem a long time ago, but we're completely out of Haiti and we're completely into the election. We're completely. I mean, there's been 2 earthquakes since, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
So kind of Haiti's 3 earthquakes ago now, and it's really curious how these things work. Perhaps I mean one of the just after the redesign, the Pakistani earthquake hit. I know we did a lot on that, but I mean I don't remember seeing any pictures of that area since.
No.
And it just goes out of your head, and you think perhaps we should start travelling around the world, revisiting these disaster zones.
Yeah, I'd be very keen to. I mean, we've got video teams that have gone back to Haiti. They're there at the moment. Actually, they're doing a sort of longer-term piece, looking at 4 particular stories, 1 month, 3 months, and then they'll go back in another 3 months to do a 6-month piece. And yeah, but that's a sort of long-term thing. I think as a photographer or something more for the paper, I'm very keen to go back. And I'm sure that the kind of these 6-month points and year on, there'll certainly be a lot of journalists flooding
anniversary
there.
journalism.
Yeah, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Really, according to what Inigo's saying.
Just one other point. I mean, if you went again to another disaster like this, undoubtedly there'll be another one because we've had 2 or 3 since. What would you do differently, or what would you demand of me or the organisation? Or
I think there's very little you can demand on the ground before you go because it's always such an unknown, and part of me feels like I learned so much there, but I'm kind of realistic that if I went to a different disaster, all of those rules would mean nothing because I mean, this was so unique in its kind of urban setting. It was just, and I suppose every disaster is different. Like you mentioned the Pakistan earthquake, which was up in the hills. It was spread all over the place.
Travelling and trekking, I think, wasn't it?
So I feel like even though I learned a lot, and I'd love to try and put those lessons into practice if I did go to another such job, then yeah, I just feel like that everything would be completely different. But saying that, the main thing is to try and make sure I'm a bit more independent, really, able to pick up on things on my own. Like I saw in Haiti, these photographers flying around on the backs of mopeds, like 2 photographers travelling around with 2 mopeds, and I was so jealous of them. They just looked like they were so free and able to get everywhere, and yeah, maybe I'd get a moped, a tent and a moped.
A tent and a moped, yeah. And a pocket full of dollars.
Pocket full of dollars
is the biggest tool.
Yeah, no, I mean, money was not, I mean, thanks to Ed, the journalist, we had a really good setup, actually, with a kind of quite a wealthy family whose house survived, and they were kind of a philanthropic family that had a lot to do in some of the poorer communities in Cité Soleil, and they were great, actually. They facilitated us every day. That we had a good internet connection there, and yeah, so although I'm always talking about kind of breaking free of journalists and these constraints, I did have a lot to thank Ed for, really, in keeping us going and keeping us fed and everything.
I wonder what happened to that boatload of corrugated iron that Gordon Brown promised. Do you remember that? You were there at the time, but he sent a load of corrugated iron.
I think I do remember hearing something like this.
I haven't ever seen the results of that.
No. And
are we?
No, I've got a question.
I've got one. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask both of you, from an editor's and from a photographer's perspective, about the ethics of photography in things such as natural disasters and war. And I know that you sometimes have a dilemma about, as an editor, about what's too horrific to show, and also as a photographer about when you should be using your camera and when you should just be putting it away. So
you go first.
Well, thank you. Well, I think you do have certain situations, I guess, where you'd rather not take pictures, but that doesn't happen a lot, I'd say, in that kind of situation, because there's so much going on, so much horror and disaster, and you do feel like it's your job to report on what you're seeing. So unless you feel like you're actually causing somebody some real upset by sticking a camera in their face or even picking a camera up, otherwise you just kind of shoot everything in a way, and then rely on your editing skills back on the computer, your own set of criteria about what images you're going to choose to present. But then the responsibility really lies with people like Roger back home, because you're sending a load of pictures and you might think this one's good or that one's good, and then ultimately it's your responsibility, I guess, to see what makes it onto the page, really.
Have you got that, Charlie? We thought this might come up, so we've had a case in point this week that I thought I'd show you from the Chinese earthquake. Excuse me. I've been working on the paper for a couple of weeks because it's the Chinese one. Been working on the paper for a couple of weeks because of the election, and we do kind of slideshow. We have a news meeting at midday and a news meeting again about 6 o'clock in the evening, and we produce a kind of a slideshow of pictures that we've selected from our incoming picture feeds. And Fiona, my colleague, who was doing everything else about the election, put this into the picture show. Now, I wouldn't have, this is a dead child, by the way, I wouldn't have put this picture in because I just feel that we shouldn't publish that picture. She put it in because she feels slightly differently from me. So she put it in and thought the duty editor should be shown it, and he said, "Oh, well, we probably should publish that, shouldn't we?" Threw it open to the meeting. So I said no. There's no kind of dignity in that picture. I just don't think we should publish it. The home editor said we shouldn't publish it. He then got accused of being a bit soft, in a kind of gentle, sort of gentle way. It wasn't published in the end, and I think that was quite right. But it was interesting for me, really, because I don't work on the paper every day now. I've kind of been kind of kicked upstairs a bit. So and there's been a change of regime, and the present duty editor is much sort of keener to engage with pictures like this, which it's fine. Everybody has their own opinions and things change. But I think it's been quite remarkable, really, over the last couple of years, how this kind of picture is more and more acceptable. Now, his argument, I mean, I shouldn't really be putting his arguments, but he's not here to do it. His argument is that pictures like this make it easier for people in this country to engage with this sort of disaster. I mean, I just don't really see that, really. I think there's some pictures that are just too undignified, and I think this is one of them.
I think I would try and do it in a different way, really. I think you're exactly right. I think that the showing ultimately the child's face is really kind of crossing a line, really. I think in all the pictures of death that I had published or sent through, I don't think any of them actually identified the person, whether they were children or... I didn't come into contact with any children.
Has anybody got any opinions that they want to throw in? Chat there.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd probably point out that I don't think there's any dignity in disaster. And secondly...
Oh, I've got something to... I'll show those other pictures. Anyway,
but
sorry.
I understand in terms of... I think it's in two facets. I think one is that by showing anonymous corpses, by not showing faces, I think it makes it harder. You see people more as statistics. It's another body in the street. It's not a person.
Yeah.
And it seems quite strange to focus quite heavily on individual stories, on, obviously there are more positive stories on the baby being saved and taken to the UK, or focusing on families, and not to focus on the fact that it's not just another Haitian who's dead. It's this specific Haitian who's dead. And I think, by putting a face to the tragedy, you give it a human face. It's not just... this to an image is a powerful image, and I think the problem is because there's now a language to a certain extent of journalistic cliches in photojournalism, particularly maybe not so much in disasters, or even now, having had a few disasters in a relatively short space of time, there is the classic, you know, hands in the air lamenting the death of a lost child.
Yeah.
There's, you know, the destruction, there's the bodies laid out at the morgue. So I think people perhaps maybe need to push further for a more shocking image in a bid to get through to what is perhaps becoming an increasingly apathetic public.
All right, yeah. Well, that's the opinion of Ian, I think.
Mm.
Can you just go back to that grid of pictures? Pull that one up. This was used by the Observer, and you know they've got a kind of great tradition of not flinching from using harsh pictures. But there again, I just think I find this all too much. I mean, perhaps I've been doing it too long and whatever. But does anybody else feel this is too harsh? And you can read about it, but you don't need to see it to understand it.
I think that picture brought home to me when I saw it on the internet much more the scale of the horror than a description of bodies in the streets. I mean, that was, when I saw it now, it still is a profoundly shocking photograph. And that had more impact on me than just about any other image I saw of just giving you a sense of the devastation of it. So I don't think it was wrong to take it. I think if there was nothing but an unending stream of those pictures, it would be too much. But to see just that one striking one, I think it was right for them to publish it.
Let's go back to that grid again.
Could I just make a comment as well?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I'm a freelance photographer, and the one thing I find in the media generally is that, I know this might sound an odd thing to say, but I don't actually think there are enough of these photographs. Because, I mean, this kind of thing goes on all the time. And I do agree with the guy who was speaking just now. You know, you can describe these things, but you don't really engage in the same way. Photography has a particular, you know, every medium has its way of, has its strengths and weaknesses. And I think photography, particularly, say an image like this, I mean, it is utterly shocking, but it's exactly, because it is such a powerful image and because it so clearly states that kind of appalling situation, that you should actually see it. I don't think we should be protected sometimes from this kind of situation. I think people should actually see the reality of what's going on.
But what if this was happening in Wales or whatever? Or Scotland?
Well, I don't think it make any difference. I think if it is, or, you know, that's the point. I mean, you know, just because you find it shocking doesn't mean that you should stop people seeing it. I mean, that's the power of photography, to inform. I mean, if you're a journalist, you know, you want to show those kind of abuses around the world. So what's the point of not seeing it?
And, you know, obviously, the only way we have of understanding a situation like this is by the stories brought back to us. And so if we're not shown the full extent of the situation, you know, this, you know, both, because as you said about the, you know, I'm a photographer as well, and the way, you know, photography, and actually this is why I sometimes, for me, with your pictures, I found your pictures much more powerful than your video. And I find that it's photography's ability to offer that iconic moment crystallized in time. And in this case, you know, it's almost a metaphor for the fact that there's so much death that the person who's having to deal with these corpses isn't even dealing with them as the corpses of people. You know, if it was one body, it would be laid reverently to rest, but instead he's throwing them like sacks off the back of a truck because he just has to deal with the situation. And I think if there was a video of that, it would perhaps be shocking, but the fact it's this iconic, you know, I mean, you've got, it's almost biblical with it. It's almost like the child's reaching back, you know. So I think...
But don't you think we should kind of ration these pictures, though?
Oh,
really
yeah, I mean, but then this is the thing. I think almost they have to become like this, because if every single image was like this, then the only way to create more impact is to go even further. And then you do reach a stage where, you know, it's gore for gore's sake without... Whereas in this case, I think very strongly illustrates a point. It's not just, you
No,
know,
no,
gore and viscera for the sake of it, just for the shock value. I think it illustrates a very important point around the story.
I mean, I think it's worth being careful about the impact of these, like this idea of iconic images, because we've spoken today about how the looting stories were kind of really blown out of proportion, and if you see one really, really striking picture in the media, it can give you, you know, you only ever see like one facet of a particular situation, and actually we've said that a lot of Port-au-Prince was very calm and a lot of aid was getting through, and a lot of, you know, there are positive stories happening as well, and it seems like it's a bit dangerous to have the temptation to show one, and I do think this photo should be shown, but I think, you know, other photos showing, you know, we should be careful to show other photos showing the rest of the situation and all the context in it, rather than just printing kind of one shocking one.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite I suppose it's quite an old-fashioned thing to say, really, but it's interesting that it was published in The Observer, like a Sunday newspaper, rather than The Guardian, which, you know, we obviously were publishing pictures every day of the week, and you just couldn't kind of ramp up to this, really, I think, on a daily basis. But perhaps The Observer publishing this was the right place. Interestingly, The Observer was the place that published the burnt Iraqi soldier from the first Iraq war. You know, that they just did that kind of one big hit, if you like, on one day of the week, and it seems to work quite well. Just one other thing, just thinking about Inigo and his kind of continuing struggle to sort of keep Haiti in the, on the news pages. Do you think that the kind of web has got a, could have a hand in that future, if you like? Because obviously there's kind of a live foreign website, and there's a Haiti web page on our site that perhaps that could sort of feed in. I mean, do you think, has anybody got an opinion about kind of new media helping in that? What about the aid agency people? Is that?
Putting stuff on Facebook, and I was actually really surprised by how interested all my Facebook friends were in what I had to say.
Are they still interested? I mean, can you still keep it live? Because
well, there has to be something sort of new to say, of course, like anything.
Well, Michelle Obama went this week, so we used a picture this week.
Yeah,
that's the only reason why we used it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm struggling with trying to go back to Haiti and bring journalists back and make them interested. I just wanted to say about that picture. It is a very powerful image, but what I worry about is that it can desensitize people. And you mentioned about Wales, and I think it's inconceivable that sort of picture would be used if it was Welsh people.
No, it wouldn't be, would it?
Yeah, and I think there's that issue because it's like, it is sort of taking, because it's removed, and I think there's my worry is that there's already a feeling that these people are other and not like us.
Well, is it another facet of the looting kind of thing? And the voodoo thing, which...
Yeah, it just makes me a little bit uncomfortable for that reason, although I can see how powerful it is. And, what the other photographers were saying, were the case that people would get that message, but I fear that they would get another message. That they would get the message about the horror and the scale of the death, but I fear that they would get the other message of being desensitized to it, and that these people don't matter because there's so many of them and they're in such a bad way.
Or their attitude to death is like this.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm. Okay, any other? That's lady in the front here.
With Haiti being such a major international story and the Guardian picture desk only being able to send half a photographer and newspapers in decline and no workable business model on the horizon, how do you see the future of photojournalism, and is there one?
I see the future of photojournalists in shooting video, because I think that inevitably, the web is going to take over. I mean, we're not, in the end, the Guardian isn't going to spend £80 million a year printing 300,000 newspapers a night. It's just going to finish. It's going to finish 4 years, 5 years. Someone can pluck the figure out. The air, it was 14 years a couple of years ago. That seems to have gone down a bit, and we're hearing 4 or 5 years. That's when the money runs out, kind of thing. But it's inconceivable that we're just going to keep printing stuff. I mean, as soon as you get a workable iPad that enough people buy, you can see it kind of migrating to the web. And I think if it does migrate to the web, photojournalists have got to shoot video, because what will happen is, you'll get some nice stills, you know, like our iPad Eyewitness app, but I think what's going to happen is you're going to have embedded videos all over these pages to pop up, and I think that's where, well, if someone's going to want to work in the media's going to be, the visual media is going to be video, I suspect, because I don't think, I mean, I really like audio slideshows and galleries and things, but the kind of the journalistic management is focused on video, and photographers aren't very powerful voices or picture editors. You know. Yeah, sorry.
Embedded video, and obviously, if you're not, sorry, if you don't, no, of course, but if you don't have, how do you feel that's going to work? Because obviously, that's a very expensive way of working, because both in terms of the equipment involved, in terms of outfitting a team of people, and also in terms of the man hours involved in editing the footage, rather than one writer writing a story and pictures coming back from picture desks. You know, video is a much more long and involved process, as you've said. You know, the length of time it takes to produce it and then to take an edit from the volume of the material, it seems quite an inefficient way of working. If you're then not selling paper newspapers to fund that, you know, there needs to be a business model.
I think people like Dave are going to be worked like dogs, really.
Yeah, I think that's the way it seems to be going.
There are different ways. This was very much treated as a kind of feature video, where it was accepted that I'd go for a week, shoot a load of material, and actually shot loads of material, and it was a nightmare. But yeah, we kind of established that we had that time to work on it. But then I think it's also about working out how you respond to things very quickly, like with the other cameras that we were talking about, the stills cameras that shoot video. My ideal at the moment is to have sort of two systems where I'm always keeping that camera that's able to shoot sound, so I know I can get something quick, newsy, and just do it and get it back and theoretically cut it relatively quickly for the web, and also have the option of doing the more feature-ish things that you kind of work on and spend more time on, I guess in the same way as a kind of traditional photo story, really, and the kind of differences of responding to kind of more artish or feature photography and the kind of cut and thrust of daily news, really. And I don't know, I like to think that there's maybe a kind of midway in the future of stills and video.
Yeah, I mean,
but maybe not.
I go up and down. I'm a bit gloomy. Some weeks, and this week I'm a little bit gloomy.
Yeah.
I think the future really is something like The Guardian being produced a couple of times a week, possibly. So basically, you have the huge website with video and all the other stuff, and then perhaps you'd have a considered kind of printed matter that would have gorgeous images in long reads. That's my hunch, but no one's actually said that to me. But
an interesting.
Funny enough, my first job was on the Hackney Gazette, which was bi-weekly, and that seemed quite enough to me. 2 papers a week, that was fine, you know. So I wonder if that's the way, you know, like better paper. It's interesting, the relaunched Observer, the reviews printed on better paper, and it just looks really nice. And it's kind of got longer reads and bigger pictures. And I think the Observer review is possibly where quality journalism is at the moment. If you look at that, you think, well, that's the latest incarnation from a kind of an news organisation that's kind of thinking about things. Okay, they might have thought about scrapping it completely, but I mean, that's what they produced after a lot of thought, you know, probably 6 months thought about what can we do next. And what they've done is produced, you know, something on heat set product on good paper with long reads and big pictures. And you think, well, actually, that's what I was thinking. And the main paper, interestingly enough, I think talking about the Observer, is, you know, produced much more quickly. And a lot of emphasis is going on to the review. And also it used to be like a sort of an art section. Now there's crossover, so there's news going into that as well, news reviews going into that. And I'm wondering whether that's becoming a bit of a model, really.
And that's, I think, again, to do with the immediacy of news on the web. That often you read the newspaper and you think, I've read this. been through all of this already,
Well,
and because you're reading the news that comes through on the web, which I guess
Yeah.
supports that theory that the newspaper will go more towards a kind of reflection on the news or a magazine style.
Just to illustrate that, at our kind of news meeting at midday today, one of the financial editors there, and one of the results of this, the grounding of the aircraft, is that by tomorrow or the next day, there's going to be no tropical fruit in any supermarkets. It's all just it's flown in kind of the day before and sold within 2 days. So basically, if you want your strawberries from Zimbabwe or wherever they come from, Kenyan beans, they're not going to be there. And it seems quite a good story, doesn't it? And the web news editor sitting there saying, so we'll put this up now. The newspaper editor is saying, should we leave that for the morning? Should we keep that for tomorrow? That's an interesting kind of consumer story, which they like to feed the readers. But the web won out, so that story is now up. Now, presumably, as soon as BBC sees that on our website, they'll think, oh, that's a nice little story. If they haven't already done it, that's a nice little story. We'll do that. So by tomorrow morning, it might have been playing on News 24 for 10 hours, and on News at 10 tonight, and whatever. Was it? Well, whether it was our story or not, I don't know. But so it was all being fed upon. Which way it went, I don't know. One of our guys might have nicked it off the BBC website at 9 o'clock this morning. I don't know, but so it's gone, isn't it? And you read it already, and it's been in media. So the newspaper by tomorrow. What is it really? It's just more information about that news item that you heard at 5.
It turns more into this kind of comment thing about news as opposed to reporting.
That's right. But what's interesting, you've got in a meeting in the same organisation 2 people kind of discussing what should go where. That's the reality of things, and the paper's losing out every time.
I have a question about the role of picture agencies. If the move to video continues, as you say, from still photography. At the moment, what's happening is stock photography is providing a very cheap way to stock images are used more and more instead of assignment photography. But with video, do you still think the picture agencies will really have a role, or will it be done in-house with staff?
They're trying to get a role, aren't they, for themselves? And
I see photographers taking little snippets of video on little news jobs quite a lot now, actually, for agency photographers. I think that was one of the things about sending us to Haiti, was trying to produce something other than what would be fed through the agencies, or because I guess they pick up news feeds, don't they, from Reuters or whatever. But
the truth of it, the matter is, it's an incredibly expensive thing to do, to send someone like David to Haiti, and not many people are doing it. We're still trying to do it, and kind of Auto Trader is paying for it, if you like. I don't know where our money comes from, but and it's a lot easier just to get agency feeds. That's why so much of the paper's being filled with agencies to pay for things like this, and these sorts of things are kind of crown jewels, really. But I think there is a future for. I think there's just a kind of future in it still. I'm quite optimistic, really, about how things will pan out. I think people will still want to buy papers.
And for independent photographers who are not staff, or independent video photographer, still photographer people.
I just think every photographer who wants to work in the media needs to be able to shoot video, needs to say, yeah, I can do that, and kind of be able to back that up. And they probably also need to be able to edit as well now.
But there'll be
that's our car crash editing.
And sleep at some point and eat.
But you think there's a market that will buy independent productions, either on the web or wherever? Yeah.
I think what I'm finding is that our budgetary constraints, or our budget, is a long way behind the kind of reality, really. Like, I haven't got a budget to buy in audio slideshows. I keep saying, well, actually, we need to set aside some money because we need to do this, and we need to be able to buy them in like we would buy. You know, today, an agency in Essex has flown over Gatwick and got a nice aerial view of Gatwick, and so we bought that in. I mean, you know, we paid a little bit more for it because they had to fly and everything in a helicopter, I guess. So we've bought that in, and at the same time, you know, I was offered a really nice audio slideshow on something today. I can't remember what it was now, and I thought it would be nice to buy that in, but actually, I haven't really got a budget because, you know, our kind of accounts department haven't actually caught up with what sort of things we really want to buy in this world yet. Quite interesting, really.
There's difficult pricing structures as well, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's the other. It seems in the freelance world really difficult for people to get their head around how much you charge for, and it is a massive amount of work essentially, usually, to produce a sort of piece of video that you're happy with, you're cutting, and it feels, and I guess I'm kind of shielded slightly from this because of my relationship with The Guardian, but it feels like people always say, well, there's so much work, how am I going to get paid to do the amount of work that needs to be done for that video? And I don't really know what the answer is, actually, but it's definitely a concern.
I'm kind of old enough to remember a dark room in The Guardian, and I've been saying all along that what is needed is a kind of video editing dark room, if you like. So what happens, he comes in, throws them some, whatever you shoot it on, a disc or something. Yeah. So he just sort of, so there's a sort of quite a big editing team, because I think that's what's needed and that's what's lacking. But of course what's happened is, you know, we've hit financial oblivion at the same time as we had all these plans. And it's just been totally frustrating, really. Because I think by now we would have been much further down the road of video and audio slideshows and everything like that. But we've just been constrained back. Probably a terribly confused message, isn't it? But it's Friday night. Yeah.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there, but
Right,
thank
okay.
you so much to Roger Tooth and David Levene and Inigo Gilmore
Yeah,
for
great.
speaking to us.
Thanks for coming.